Aloha and welcome to today's episode of Lay Stories. I am your host, Kara, and today I am joined by the delightful Hugette Montesinos Rodriguez. She is one of my dearest friends and an inspiration. I invite you to just take a seat and enjoy our conversation today. Thank you so much, Hugette, for joining me. We've begun making our carnation lei. So lei making is a tradition rooted in connection and love. Who in your life are you wanting to honor with this lei today from your heart?
Thanks, Carol, first of all, for having me. And really, it's such an honor to do life with you and to have a friendship with you. And today, for the first time, to get to join in this treasure that is lei making with you. So I think today I would like to dedicate this experience, conversation, and piece of art to probably one of the most influential people in my life, who is Michel. I'm going to try to keep my tears back.
Yeah. Wow. I happen to know Michel, actually, and I don't know if our viewers know who that is. So can you share a little bit more about who this beautiful man is?
Yeah, so Michel he passed 2 years ago, but he was someone who came into my life as a pastor initially, so a spiritual mentor, but eventually almost as a father figure, an earthly father figure. And the thing about Michel is that he was one of the first people that helped me understand who I was holistically to God. And there's always a relationship that we have with God as God being this sovereign, huge figure in our life and who we feel in relation to him. But I think he was the first one that allowed me to understand just how tangible God is, just how close he is to us, and just how intentional he crafted every nook and cranny of our character, of our personality, of even our gifts. And really understanding that from a multi-dimensional perspective allowed me to begin to not just know God, but to love God. And I think my relationship with him throughout probably a little over a decade transformed what it felt like to really know God, to understand Scripture, to allow Scripture to come alive, but most importantly, start from the foundation of knowing God's heart. Because without knowing God's heart, there's multiple ways in which I interpreted everything that had to do with the whole arena of God, but understanding his heart and just starting from the place of his love allowed everything to take on this rose-colored lens in which I could really begin to sense God's love in every microfiber of life.
You had a relationship that was so rich, it seems. And he passed away 2 years ago, yet you're dedicating this and honoring him with this lei. So obviously he left something with you of significance. And a lot of times when we make our lei, we're thinking about that person. I think of this concept, kapu aloha, as a reverence, as a way to honor and reflect on whoever this recipient is going to be. And so for Alex, what would you say would be your word of life or words of life that you'd like to string or kui into this lei today?
I think it's probably 2 words. I think the first one, I mean, they're both going to maybe even sound a little bit superficial, but there's so much depth to these things and these words that sometimes even we judgingly assume things are of a superficial level, when to God they have so much substance and so much depth. And I think the first one is creativity. And creativity has been such a part of my life that for so many years I felt ashamed of, for the very reason that it is often sidebarred as something supplementary or accessory and non-essential. And when God wires you as a creative person, you think that that is somehow subpar or just not as useful to influencing and impacting people's lives. And so PA, or Pastor Alex, as we call him, was one of the first people that highlighted this attribute of God and said that this was actually a divine inheritance. And understanding that was, I mean, it literally breathes life into my bones, knowing and understanding that creativity is actually one of the key attributes of God, and that I got to embody that. And I think the other word, which again, it's very much iconic to me and just my Latino culture too, but it's deliciousness. And it's something that really, as someone that is very driven by joy and by things that have beauty from extrinsic to intrinsic, just deliciousness. And so being able to taste the flavors of who God is and the colors of who he is and the tangible aspects of who he is, it's something that Michel really highlighted in my life, and through the Holy Spirit has just permeated every aspect of my life. And when deliciousness feels like it's missing, that becomes almost like an anchor or cornerstone to say, okay, where is God missing in all of this? Because I know he's not in the midst, he's not present, because his spirit is delicious, and we need to kind of recalibrate.
People go through life chasing after certain experiences and things, people, status. What is this deliciousness that you speak of?
Well, I love that you asked that question, because a lot of people do confuse joy and happiness. Sometimes they bulk them together, which is okay if they have the same meaning for you. But I think the general misconception is that joy is somehow absent of adversity. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because it's actually adversity and difficulty that gives life to joy. Because in the way that a lot of people would separate them, you would think, or we could say, that happiness are really circumstantial things. They're things that ideally are going the way that we want them to go. However, joy is a consistent ingredient regardless of the fluctuations of life. And so it's in spite of difficulty, not because of it. And so, or not because of the lack of it. And so I've really understood that deliciousness is something that can be experienced, particularly in the presence of the joy of the Lord, which, as we know, is something that can be experienced and in fact is heightened when we're at our lowest. And so, just even going back to the role of Alex in my life, my father's never been around. And so even having a male figure in my life, what it looks like to have a functioning marriage dynamic, so being able to see his marriage, or having a father around, so being able to see how he is with his children and how he was to his spiritual children as well. That was just so healing. But it was also very painful, because you're confronted with the things that you've never had and probably will never have. So it was in understanding what that deliciousness meant, and understanding it biblically and also scientifically, which is something I'm very passionate about, because it turns out God is always right. And science now proves that. So it's been a really beautiful journey for me to learn more about myself and the role of suffering and of adversity, and really understanding that we can suffer well. And so going through hardship never feels good. It's never joyful in terms of the external aspects that we can imagine, or even emotionally doesn't feel well. But I think when we look at it from a spiritual perspective, we never understood meaning and our identity when things were simple. Like you understand the meaning of life when you go through things such as divorce, which I went through, or not having a father, which I went through, or failing, which I've gone through multiple times. It's never that 1 week in Disneyland, right? It's never that wonderful time that I just succeeded and I went through with flying colors. And so I've really understood that those are really almost like this secret garden door to the treasures that nothing and no one will ever be able to take away from you.
You said something about suffering or having adversity and being able to find joy in the suffering. That's a very foreign concept to a lot of people, because we oftentimes are slaves to our circumstances, especially the ones that are not so great. And I think we fall into maybe patterns of thinking that we might be a victim, or this is never going to change, or just pessimism, maybe even depression or depressive symptoms. What does it mean to suffer joyfully?
I think I would bring it back to a particular experience that I had. Now, I have to start by prefacing that I don't know if that would have been possible for me without God in my life. So the experience that I had, that I can remember like it was yesterday, and it's been about 2 decades now, while I was going through my divorce. It was one of the scariest, loneliest, most inconclusive times of my life. I had an expectation of what my life was going to look like, even a vision and a dream of what my life was about to look like or what I had just entered. And all of a sudden that was shattered to pieces. And it was like being in a dark tunnel where there was not even a glimpse of light on the other side. And I remember I was going through the grieving process. And while my emotions and I guess you could say my my animal nature wanted to escape and just turn the other way.
Yeah.
In my spirit, I felt that I had to face this. And so there were two options: escape it and this thing will come back forever, or just confront it and it may hurt, but there's something else on the other side. There's a blank slate on the other side. And so I remember kind of carving out grieving sessions. And so I would come home, whether from work or from school. At the time I was finishing grad school, and I would just have crying sessions. And I remember I would just get on my knees, and I remember looking at the wood floor. I would get about this close to it, and I just remember the teardrops would just fall on the ground, and I would just cry and wail and just grieve deeply. And at the same time, I would have never imagined, I would just feel this little, almost like if there was like a little tiny person inside of me that was like jumping. It was the craziest, weirdest thing.
Jumping for joy?
Yes, like jumping for joy, as if like we're one day closer. We're one day closer. And I don't think I would have ever experienced, and what I would call that is hope. And I don't think I would have ever experienced that little glimmer of hope had it not been because I was able to completely release the pain that was just bottled up and that was basically keeping a mask over anything that could lie underneath that pain. And so it was almost like pain needed to be released so that anything else could be tangibly felt. And so in that moment, I realized that hope came from a place of knowing that although everything around me was falling apart, God still held my life and he had good plans for me. And while I couldn't see that, I couldn't imagine that, I couldn't imagine myself loving someone else, I couldn't imagine myself in a different scenario, in a different home, in a different state of mind or heart, I knew that I was safer than any other place in the palm of God's hand. And so that little jumping man inside my heart got a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger each day. And so I realized that suffering and extreme pain can coexist with hope. And that hope somehow, I would say, mutate or alchemizes into what we understand as joy.
Wow. Practically speaking, when somebody is in such a state of turmoil, sometimes they don't know what to do. So you at least had the Lord, the God, you talked about the tangible thing of like releasing the pain. Releasing the pain, was that through breath? Was that through prayer? Was that through how do you release your pain?
Oh, it was screaming and crying. Yeah, literally screaming and crying on my knees and just saying, God help me, God help me. I'm hurting, this hurts, this sucks, I hate it. And just being as real as I could be. And I remember hearing at some point in that season that God wanted every aspect of you, and God wanted nakedness, complete nakedness, the kind of nakedness that you cannot have with anybody else, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And I said, this is about as naked as I can get. This is how I actually feel, and there has to be one person that I don't hold this back from. And so understanding that there was this space of freedom, I wouldn't say safety, because at that moment I didn't know God deep enough as I do today.
Okay.
So it didn't feel as safe as I could say today, but it felt like a relief to be able to just let it all out, whether it was as safe or not as it would have been with a tangible person. But I started to experience that as I just was screaming and crying and letting it all out. The more I did that, the more I could sense that little flame of hope just kind of strengthen. It was the wildest, most counterintuitive thing I've ever experienced.
It sounds very counterintuitive, which is why I'm trying to logically wrap my mind and brain around this. Yeah. So you were kind of blindly doing that because there wasn't any, you mentioned you didn't know God as intimately as you do now.
Right.
And so this entity that you're screaming out to, you don't, I mean, how does that how does that, I mean, did you know PA at that time? And how did that relationship maybe transition your intimacy or the way that you see God and how you release your pain to him?
I did know God some bit, right?
Okay.
So I knew some of scripture. I had started to go to a church, and I was starting to get more and more familiar with the concept of God, and I felt like my heart was a little bit softer than it would have been at a different season in my life. But I would say that I didn't know him intimately enough to know that he was, in fact, an emotional, spiritual, safe place. But I felt like I had no choice. So you almost get to a point of desperation where it's either this or death. And I know that sounds extreme, but really that's where I was at. And so I think sometimes we do. This is why these moments of suffering and adversity really do bring about so much meaning, because it's only when you realize I've got no other option that you succumb to whatever you think is going to be the solution. And at that point, I started to actually anchor in something that was bigger than myself, because I could fix so many other things. I grew up with a very strong single mother who was able to fend for herself and taught me how to do the same. And so sometimes these strengths can also be your kryptonite. And so for me, it was my default mechanism, and it was my MO to just fix things, solve things. And the interesting thing about that too is that I was very good at managing my joy levels because of that. I understood, handle the things that you can control and don't try to control the things that you can't.
Okay.
Up to that point, I knew that very well. So I was able to really work with my happiness set point, let's say. But when you're hit with a devastating life situation, such a point of grief and loss where you are at your wit's end, you realize none of that works. None of your mechanisms, none of your hacks, none of your frameworks, none of it works, because it goes beyond a level of understanding, even of yourself, that only God can access.
Surrender.
Yeah.
That's what I hear.
Forced surrender.
Forced surrender.
Yeah.
You come to the end of yourself and you just, as you said, release your pain, cry out, scream out. Just probably gutturally on the floor, on your knees, on your face, on your bed, wherever you are. And then your joy or your hope, or you said your hope starts to grow a little bit, and that transitions into joy.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
So I realize this process of the delicious life that you speak about is just that, and it's not an overnight thing. What would you say to somebody who is experiencing right now some kind of adversity or suffering, and they might be listening and hear your story and think, well, that's nice. Like, good for her. That sounds like a great concept. I don't know where to go. I feel my hands are tied and I can't necessarily see myself necessarily doing all of that. What would you say to that person?
What I would say to that person, to start off, is to be self-aware. I've always been a very cynical person, naturally, and kind of skeptical, especially around the arena of spirituality and religion, let's just say. And as many people today, I categorize myself as spiritual, quote unquote, but not religious. And so I had a lot of stigma and a lot of rejection toward the whole religious ambiance. But I think because of that, I displaced and conflated God.
Yeah.
And that was a really big problem, because then God felt inaccessible, or at least undesirable to me. And so although I had a need for God, I didn't have an interest for God, because the whole ambiance in which I believed he moved in did not attract me and I didn't connect with. So what I had to do was, again, absorbing a little bit of that creativity that I believe he placed in me, I had to really understand, how do I function? What attracts me? What do I find joy in? What are things that naturally seem to me like a joyful, peaceful place? And I started to just notice that even in the tangible things, right? What are certain spaces? What are certain books? What are certain types of music that I gravitate to? Because honestly, I've always been very sensory.
Yeah.
And so sensory things bring about a certain internal emotion for me. And I think it does for most people, but most people are actually unaware of what those things are and how much they affect you. I mean, from light to a certain sound to a certain melody. And so I started almost like a personal research project.
Curiosity.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so there was like a curiosity of what are all the things that to me feel delicious, really, in a way. And I started to realize all those things were very divorced from how I saw God.
Wow.
So I started to say, what if I start to bring God into each of these things, or I start to see if God has these attributes? And so in that arena, I started to realize that God, I mean, not only did he have attributes of this, but he was the epicenter of it all. But because I had believed that that it had to look a certain way, I was confusing the way that it was manifested in somebody else for the way that it had to manifest in my life.
Wow.
And so I think one of the biggest obstacles to our spiritual life and to really growing in God and growing spiritually and flourishing spiritually even is that we seek formulas. And especially in our information era where we want quick fixes and we want drive-through solutions, we want what worked for you, give that to me.
Yeah.
Right? What works for the church? What works for the kupuna?
Yeah.
What works for the keiki? Let's just all kind of dive into the same thing. And what works for the more goal-oriented person versus the more mentally fluid person.
Sure.
Right? So really understanding that being self-aware and saying these are my limitations and these are my strengths, that's okay because you're going to find God in that territory. Like that is literally the soil that God has prepared to meet you in. So if you're going to somebody else's territory, you're going into somebody else's yard, you're not going to intersect with God because he has set coordinates that are only and uniquely set for you.
So it's not one size fits all.
It's not.
And you were trying to, frustratingly so, fit yourself into what you thought you were supposed to conform to.
Yes.
So let's bring it back to this other word that you talked about. So the first word is delicious, and the second word is creativity. And God is at the epicenter of creativity. And lei-making is inherently creative.
Yes.
It is an art form.
Yes, it is.
And this is your first time making, which is awesome. But you've created a lot of things in your life. What role does creativity play in your life as far as just expression? And maybe we can even bring it back to PA and how he encouraged you in expressing yourself unapologetically in a way that, you know, you are just free to be Hugette Montesinos Rodriguez.
Yeah. I think creativity is a sliver, gives each and every one of us an opportunity to reveal to the world a sliver of God's mind and God's heart. And when we either shame our creativity, we shame our inherent design, or we shame the expression of said gifts and deposits that God puts in us, we're literally hindering the world by keeping away from them or from holding back something that is purely going to bless and is going to impact somebody's life. And I think that if we kind of reverse engineer that, we'll see that spiritually speaking, that is the Achilles heel of the average person. They'll either say, I'm not creative.
Yep.
You know, that's not me. I wish I could.
I've heard that so many times.
Right?
Yeah.
Then for the one who is creative, they might say, I am creative, but a lot of times there's a stunting point. There's somewhere they feel stuck. There's somewhere where they feel like, oh, I can't get this out because of XYZ. And there will be a list.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I find that creativity is such, I mean, every single person has it. And if we really look at the heart of God, I think that creativity, in a way, is one of the definitions of love. Because God created because he loved.
Yeah.
And
beautiful.
so if you think about it, parents might love their children, but parents didn't even choose their children. And yet God has us while he not only chose us, but designed us. And so design and creativity is at the heart, at the core of love.
I have never thought about creativity that way. That he created us out of a place of love. And so you are creating out of a place of love as his image bearer. So what is your philosophy now on creativity as you create all the things in your life?
Anytime I engage creativity, I am engaging in such an intimate process with God.
Yeah.
And you're so many things. You're co-laboring with God, but you're also being a vessel to God.
Yeah.
So it's a multi-functional, multi-level experience where you are being met by and meeting with God. It gives texture to something that sometimes we can't articulate with words. For me, it's seeing how somebody says, oh my gosh, I love this color, or gosh, you know, this outfit, it just brings me joy, or there's something about your essence. And again, people sometimes don't even know how to say what it is that they're feeling, but they sense the presence of God. They sense joy, they sense peace, they sense something that they are attracted to. And that really is the presence of the Holy Spirit. And so for me, creating, what I find that's really interesting too is that a hindrance for me to engage creativity has often been a results-driven expectation. And so
Pressure.
it's a major pressure and a killjoy.
Yeah.
And so I think that my reinterpretation of creativity is that I will have to forever, because I am a human being and these things just kind of creep up, is every time I'm about to engage something creative, I have to check a result expectation at the door.
Wow. Leave it at the door.
Leave it at the door.
Has perfectionism ever gotten in the way for you?
It has. Oh, many times.
Yeah.
Many times, because it really depends on the context of creativity. Is this going to be just for me, like if I'm journaling, or is this going to be for the world, like something I'm going to share on social media or in the magazine, etc.? And so it really does depend on audience and who the audience is, to what degree I'm going to nitpick at the perfection level that I believe each thing has to have. So what I found is that the joy levels become stripped and become watered down the more it becomes extrinsic, the more it becomes on the result, versus the creating for creation's sake and really remembering that I'm not in charge of results. Because if I am in fact channeling a sliver of God, it's never been about me. Nothing that's flowing out of me comes from me. And so the pressure's off.
Beautiful. As we wrap up our lay making today, what would you say to the generation coming up in this life filled with creativity and promise, but might feel stuck and in the box of life?
Creativity has to be understood as an essence or an attribute of God, and engaging with it is a privilege. And it's a privilege not to be taken lightly. And by that I mean not to personalize it, not to embellish it, but to really allow it to flow. And I think the most important thing I want to encourage our generation, future generations, my daughter's generation, is that you would first seek God, that you would seek knowing Him so that you can actually understand who you are. You'll never find who you are out in the world. You might never even find who you are by looking just inside. You have to go deeper than that. And the deeper places are the places that only God accesses and that only God can give you access to. And when you tap into that, you'll be able to create as an expression of the ultimate creator.
Thank you so much, Hugette. I hope this story has inspired all of you at home to discover your delicious life and to just go for it. Start creating, start being curious, start being a little bit more self-aware of what brings joy into your life. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Aloha.